is Marianne Williamson, lecturer and author of 11 books, including A Year of Miracles, Daily Devotions and Reflections, and recent independent candidate for Congress from California's 33rd District. Hey, Marianne.
Great to see you, Thom.
It's great to have you physically in the studio this time. So first of all, what do you take of your take on the media's coverage of Ebola?
Well, I don't think the media's coverage of Ebola is that different than the media's coverage of almost anything. Fear has become our default position in far too many cases. But the problem really is that there is such a thing as healthy fear. But the fear that is the fear-mongering and the sensationalism, as in the case of Ebola, is actually displacement. When some things that we should be afraid of, perhaps, or alarmed about are genuinely alarming, such as many of the things you talk about, voting rights suppression. This is what we should be afraid of, disintegrating democratic freedoms, things we should be afraid of. So it's all a way of kind of taking our attention towards things that are sensationalized for the sake of getting the headline, so that more money could be made, and also keeping some of our outrage from where it should be.
Yeah. So if it bleeds, it leads, and this is like,
yes,
it's a hemorrhagic
Ebola,
fever.
But a lot of things.
Yeah. Should we expect anything else from the likes of, well, not just Fox News, but right across the board?
It's corporate media. I don't think it's only the right-wing media.
Yeah.
And, you know, I think that with Ebola, I think there are some very serious things to look at here. For instance, if we had a nationalized health system, the government could be far more effective. You know, I was watching a news program the other day, and it was talking about the CDC was talking about the fact that Americans don't have to worry because we have this handled, we have all these experts and all these protocols in place. And then the very next segment was talking about how 80% of nurses in the United States say that they haven't been given any kind of direction. 87% of nurses said that they hadn't been any kind of education. So I think a deeper issue here is that whether it's Ebola or ISIL or anything else, I think in a way that has never been true in my lifetime, we don't know. We don't necessarily believe anything. American people feel now we don't know whether to believe it if the government says it. We don't know whether to believe it if the media says it. This is what's dangerous, that there are so few genuinely what we feel to be trustworthy sources of news and information and perspective.
It's a really interesting analysis. It seems that there are a couple of pieces to that. One is we have a government that lied us into a war in Iraq.
Correct.
That you know, that shatters confidence.
And that there has been no acknowledgement of this, and no one held accountable for that. So it's not corrected, it just sits out there.
Right, and in a way it's a replay of the Gulf of Tonkin. I mean,
yes, absolutely.
You know, an earlier generation went through this.
Many of us said at the time, in the run-up to the war in Iraq, this is Vietnam all over again, and we were, you know, everybody said we were such facile thinkers, you know, what lightweight analysis.
Yeah, but it's, actually, I think it's very, very solid.
Absolutely.
The other piece of it is, up until 1987, during the Reagan presidency, there was a rule that went back to the 20s with the Federal Communications Commission that said that if a radio or TV station wanted to get their license renewed every year, they had to demonstrate that they were programming in the public interest. That was the magic phrase. And the way that they demonstrated this was by running news at the top of the hour and a newscast on television stations every evening, 5 days a week. And in order to provide genuine news that was really programming in the public interest, the networks lost money. They had bureaus all over the world, ABC, CBS, NBC. They were all losing money in their news divisions. And in '87, Reagan blew that up. It was called the Fairness Doctrine. He said, we're not going to enforce this anymore. And within 6 months, CBS had moved their news division under the arm of the entertainment division vice president and turned their news division into a profit-making entity. To what extent do you think that's now driving?
Well, it's huge. There used to be a firewall. Theoretically, the news and editorial weren't even on the same floor. They weren't supposed to talk to each other. And then it was under Clinton, Michael Powell, of course, things even went further. So at this point, and you know, the conversation that you've been holding with all of us that's been so brilliant, that this is part of, is the larger issue of corporate responsibility, not just in the news media. And when you talk about these things happening in the 80s or in the 90s or in the 20s, too many Americans today don't even have an institutional memory or an education in the fact that there was a time when corporations, whether news media corporations or any other, that it was considered reasonable to expect them to have some responsibility to the people of the United States, both in truth-telling, in ethics, et cetera. So it's all part of a larger conversation by which corporations, whether media or otherwise, are just deemed entitled to lie or do anything else if it will increase their financial bottom line. Yeah,
and apropos of the news business, back from '69, I think, until '78, I did news for WITL in Lansing, Michigan, you know, the #1 radio station in the market. And as a news reporter, I was, during that entire time, if I was even seen talking to any of the salespeople, I would be immediately fired. You were not allowed to talk to them,
Exactly.
period. No, you can't go to, can't even have a cup of coffee with them. It's like, you know, it was like Ebola.
Well, things that used to get a reporter a Pulitzer Prize are more likely to get that reporter fired today.
Yeah.
And that's because, you know, when I was a kid, the same company couldn't own the newspaper and the, you know, and the radio station, and because it was understood that there had to be this variety of opinion. With this corporate control of media, you know, you tell a story about how the factory did something, you know, put carcinogens illegally into the water. In too many cases, the same company that owns the factory owns that television station.
Right.
That's the problem we have today.
Or they have interlocking boards of
Right,
directors.
exactly.
I think the last time you were on, and maybe it was the time before the last time you were on, we were talking about you as a candidate for Congress.
Thank you for your endorsement.
Indeed, you're welcome. I'm wondering what you learned from that.
Oh, gosh. You learn as much from your failures as from your successes in life, and I learned so much. First of all, let me say what I learned that's beautiful, and that's that I am even more inspired and more convinced that the American people really do want a meaningful relationship with the public sphere, and are unhappy about the fact that the political establishment leads them as often as not away from that more meaningful relationship. So my candidacy for me was very exhilarating as well as brutal, and I would like to take the things that I've learned, because you do learn, you know, one way or the other, through pain or through joy. And I'd like to now hand that off to other people to run. I do these Sister Giant conferences. I will do one in the spring because, you know, one of the things you and I were talking about earlier, it's ironic to me, conservatives, more of the right wing in the United States, talks about how much they distrust government but are so eager to run candidates who express their views. They want people in government who express their views. Often on the progressive side, we talk about how we think government has such a good, healthy function, or can. There's also healthy skepticism that should be exercised on both sides. And yet, so often progressives train activists. You see an activist training or training citizen lobbyists. Progressives need to train candidates more. We need to demystify candidacy. So I want to do everything that I can to pass on whatever information I have so that more people who hold the kinds of views that you talk about here on this program actually run for office.
Brilliant.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so
It's
much.
great to see you.